This is Antic, the AtariAge podcast.
It wouldn't have been fun if Atari would have owned the internet.
Did you regret selling it?
Every day of my life.
Ray Kassar.
Oh, he was a disaster.
Warner didn't want to have anything to do with me. They felt that if I was back in and made a success of it, it would make them look stupid.
Hello and welcome to a very special interview-only episode of Antic, the Atari 8-Bit podcast. I'm Randy Kindig, one of your hosts for this podcast. I say special because it's not often that you get a chance to talk with an icon like the one we talk with today. Kevin Savetz and myself were given the chance to sit down, so to speak, with Mr. Atari, Nolan Bushnell, and spend a few minutes shooting the breeze. If you need any more introduction for this guest, then you're probably listening to the wrong podcast. In fact, he's one of those guys that can go by a single name, just Nolan, and everyone in the Atari community knows who you're talking about. Before we get to the interview, I want to thank the Atari community on the AtariAge forums for suggesting questions for Nolan. When we put out a request for questions, who knew we would get such a large and varied response? Regrettably, we only had time for some of them. Many of you will recognize the questions that you submitted, and we are very grateful for your help. I also want to thank Marty Goldberg for his suggestions and guidance as someone who has talked with Nolan in the past. This interview was conducted on July 30th, 2015.
Yeah, how you doing today?
Well, it's a beautiful day here in Los Angeles. I'm heading over into the valley where it's going to be hotter, but other than that, it's good.
Nice. So you're on a drive while you're talking to us today?
I am.
All right. I grew up in the valley,
Well, hopefully we won't ask any questions that cause you to have an accident or anything like that.
Yeah, I'm in bumper to bumper, so it's other than rear-ending somebody, it's going to be pretty innocent.
Okay. You want to start, Randy?
Cool.
Yeah, now, Nolan, some of these questions are going to be really geared towards the early days with the 2600 and the computers. So one question we put it out there for some people to provide some questions for us. People were curious, if you had stayed in control of Atari, what do you think would have happened differently? And what would have been Atari's priorities from the 2600 on?
Well, a couple of big ones is that Chuck E. Cheese would have stayed as part of Atari instead of it was one of those things where I think that if I had not sold to Warner, there's a couple of things you have to understand. We were about to take the company public because we knew that it was going to take about $15 million more than we had to properly launch the 2600 in terms of the size of the factory we had to outfit, in terms of the inventory we had to build, and getting the cartridge system all going, and so in some ways it was a little bit of our back was to the wall. I would have preferred to have taken it public, but the market just sort of took a dump before when we were all ready. I mean, we had the S1 all written and everything, and our underwriter selected, and then the market just didn't cooperate. But that being said, if we'd been able to figure out a way to get the funding right, there are two what I consider to be really watershed differences. The first one is that, actually there's four. The first one is Chuck E. Cheese would have stayed part of Atari, because I always saw that Chuck E. Cheese was a marketing outlet for the Atari coin-operated games. And so that and I think that we would have built a line of coin-operated games that were more kid-friendly and sold them to others, but it would also have helped Chuck E. Cheese. That's one. The second one is that I wanted to immediately start the day we shipped the first 2600, and this was after Warner owned the company. I wanted to start immediately working on the next rev of the 2600. I said, the day you launch a product, it's obsolete. And the big issue in those days was the cost of memory. And from the time we'd frozen the design and till that time, memory had dropped in cost almost to an order of magnitude. And I felt that by the time we actually got the number 2 into production, that memory would have dropped maybe as much as another order of magnitude. And, the 2600 only had 128 bytes of memory, of RAM. And as you know, that really cripples a system. And so I felt that if we could have a line buffer, or better off, a screen buffer in RAM, all of a sudden, instead of having the big blocky pixels that we had in the 2600, we could have gotten down into a more, let's call it a Nintendo-like look and feel, which I felt was important, because I thought that the minute somebody used more memory because of the better cost, that the game experience would be much better. So we would have done that, and that would have launched probably sometime in the 80 to 81 time frame. And Warner had the record company mentality, and they thought that the whole business was about creating software, not about making record players. And so that was a big problem. The third problem was that they wanted to go into the regular pinball business rather than wide bodies. I don't know if you've tracked the Atari pinballs, but we pioneered the wide body pinball machine. That was as much because we had about a $200 cost differential over Chicago, and it was $300 if you put shipping in. And I felt that if we entered the normal pinball space against the Chicago guys, there was no way we could make money. And Warner was insistent, and they got their way and found out that all of a sudden the pinball division was losing a lot of money, and they closed. So I think we'd have stayed in the pinball business for a longer period of time. The fourth issue, which is kind of speculative, we had the fastest modems in the world. And all of our patents and everything, Warner sold to U.S. Robotics. But the reason we were building those modems, we wanted to create a telephone-linked game system. And remember, this was before the Internet, before anybody had heard the word Internet, let alone, a computerized network. We were going to do a closet in each area code that had a bunch of computers, a bunch of modems that were going to switch packets between the game systems, and then we were going to link those closets together with T1s. Well, if you look at it from a technical standpoint, that clearly could have turned into a router network basis, and I've often thought, it just might have evolved into being the Internet. It wouldn't have been fun if Atari would have owned the Internet. But I don't want to do an Al Gore on us. But I can remember a conference that we had in which we were trying to decide whether game players wanted to communicate by typing to other game players. And the room was about equally divided, saying no, game players would never want to necessarily talk to anybody else, and game players probably didn't know how to type anyway, and hunting and pecking would be too slow. And that led us to, we were going to do this by hooking the modems actually into a port on the 2600. And then, of course, getting a keyboard hooked into that was a little bit tricky. But we said, okay, the computers would also, the Atari 800 and 400 could also be part of that network. But it was preliminary, but we were building the modems because we felt that was the big problem, and that we had to go faster than acoustic couplers. And a lot of people thought, well, going straight into the phone lines, that wasn't a very good idea. But, I thought that it would move in that direction.
So was this thing was it prototyped, or was it just an idea on paper?
The modems were prototyped. The structure of the network was on paper, including the IP stack, which was very, very similar to the IP protocol of the Internet.
That's interesting. Awesome. So you said, I want to clarify something. It sounds like you sold to Warner primarily because you needed the capital to build the factories to make the 2600. Is that correct?
That's correct. And the launch of a product can be very expensive because you have to put together a whole bunch of inventory before you've sold it. And remember, Atari was always funded on a shoestring because nobody believed the video game business was a business.
Did you regret selling it?
Every day of my life.
Why?
Well, I just felt, when I sold it, I was hopeful that Warner wouldn't screw it up. It's kind of your baby, and I kind of thought I was going to be with Atari for the rest of my life without all the financial headaches. And, I just hadn't realized how fundamentally incompetent big companies can be. I was young and dumb.
So Nolan, I mean, when you were talking with them about them buying Atari, I mean, did you have a pretty good feeling about them before you sold to them, or how did you feel?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
Well, they talked about how all their directors and producers, they were very hands-off. They kept creative control, in the hands of the people who knew what they were doing, da-da-da-da-da. The same old song and dance that big companies, when they're buying little companies, always say and always violate.
Were they liars or incompetent or both?
I believe it. I don't believe they thought they were telling lies. That's what makes them so convincing. But in the operation of business, people in power have just a hard time jumping in and meddling with things that they think are the right solution. And when they really don't know what they're doing. And, people who don't know what they're doing have been meddling with people who know what they're doing since business began.
So we've read that you were initially against getting into the home computer business altogether, and we're wondering if that's true. And
not
if
true.
So, did your view
not true at all.
No?
Not true at all. No, I was very enthusiastic about it.
So can you tell us kind of how that got started? I mean, who had the idea, and how did that take shape to actually make the computer line?
I think it was a combination of two guys. One was Steve Mayer, and one was Joe DeCore. Three guys, and Al Alcorn. And they felt that the 6502 would make a really good computer, and that the home computer was kind of, they saw it as a way to get a better game system into the home, and and be able to say that it's also good for you because you could word process and do all kinds of wonderful things.
And so did they bring that idea to you and sold you on it, or how did that get started?
Well, that wasn't really the way we did it. We just kind of brought up ideas, and I think it was at one of the planning sessions, or it might have been when we had a meeting up in Grass Valley, and they said, this is something that we can do, and we have the technology, and we have the understanding, and in those days, the cost of doing the research was actually quite modest, in terms of getting the design. It was, a couple of people. And then a couple of people on the operating environment and what have you. And then once you sort of had the works-like prototype, you could really put numbers together and figure out what it was actually going to cost to manufacture and to get it operational from a manufacturing and marketing standpoint. And so it's very easy to greenlight an engineering project. It took a lot more money to greenlight going into mass production and marketing.
So the computer started in 1977, or the work started in 77, I believe, is what I've heard. And we've been lucky enough to talk to Al and Joe and Steve. You left in 78, is that right?
Yes.
So how far along were things by the time you left?
Well, the thing was pretty much designed. I can remember a particular meeting where we decided to put the operating system in a cartridge, so in case it was buggy, we could have it easily swapped out.
So when it came out in 79, did you run out and buy one?
Oh, yeah.
Did you?
I think somebody actually gave me one.
And what did you think when you finally had the actual unit on your desk?
Oh, I thought it was great. And I also had an Apple II, so I pretty much understood what was going on, because the Apple II predated the Atari 800 by a little bit.
Do you still have that machine?
I think I do, actually.
Awesome. That answer implies it's in the closet or in an attic or something.
Yeah, right.
I've got a big box in the garage that's full of a lot of old Atari stuff. The one thing that I really regret is I had a whole box of ERAMs for games that never made it to the market, or cartridges. And I just, I think I ended up giving them to a nephew or something like that. And I just thought that those would really be interesting historical artifacts right now.
Absolutely.
I guess, Nolan, I'm interested in knowing your opinion about the way things turned out with, DOS and then Windows becoming the de facto standard. And do you think there's anything Atari could have done differently to survive like Apple did?
Yeah. In other words, how could you let this happen, Nolan?
Right. Well, there were two major things that happened that were totally, preventable. The one was, as I told you, Warner had a very what you'd call a software record company mentality, and they saw that they were enabling, selling these computers, and they wanted to own all the software. Steve was out evangelizing other people to write software for the Apple II. Atari was saying, if you write software for Atari, we'll sue you. We're going to, so let alone not publishing, specs and things like that. it was actually, they were hostile to the whole idea of third-party developers because they were hostile to Magic and Activision, who basically started, making cartridges for the Atari 2600. And then that was kind of followed with Nintendo when they put the scramble chip on it and to keep people from, doing clone Nintendo cartridges.
Mm-hmm.
And so that meant that things, if you really look at, people buy software and the hardware that they need to run it. And so if you really look at the spike in Apple II sales, it was when they got VisiCalc, which all of a sudden was a really valuable business tool that a lot of people saw the importance of, and they bought the Apple II for it. Atari didn't get any kind of a VisiCalc program for a year later, and that was a massive mistake. There was one other issue that was a little bit, that worked on a little bit. We were selling to Sears, and Sears required that we had really tight FCC approval, and FCC approval that Apple never got. They just flouted it. And so as a result, if you look inside the Atari 800, we had this, casting and shielding and all kinds of things. But that also said that we didn't have a bus, with the 6 or 8 slots, I don't remember the number, in the Apple II, mm-hmm. which made it much harder to develop ancillary things for. And so I don't know if I'd have done it, but I think I would have. I think I would have done another version which had an expansion bus on it, because it was very clear that the expansion bus was an interesting piece of flexibility as the technology matured.
Yeah. Do you think that Atari should have skirted the whole issue like Apple did by not including an RF modulator, or did you guys think of that, or was it on the table as a possibility?
Our problem was that we were too big and too successful working with Sears. They were too big of a company, and they wouldn't play in a world without total FCC approval. And so that drove an awful lot of our solutions. But I think that it would have been, I think I was tricky enough at the time that I would have said, well, that doesn't, we'll have a consumer version and we'll have a commercial version. Because in fact, the FCC standards that were really hard to deal with had to do with home emitters, home broadcasters. And that's kind of the, Apple always said it was a personal computer, but primarily for business. And it turned out the FCC had no teeth anyway. They, just Sears thought they did.
No. It seems like you feel that you wish Atari had reached out to developers earlier and released developer documentation before it did. Is that right?
Absolutely. I think it was a massive mistake. Because remember, we had sprites, we had an integrated circuit in it, along with the 6502. The Atari 800 was a significantly better computer than the Apple II, and yet, with the exception of the expansion bus, that being said, Apple beat our ass, and we actually had a lower cost of manufacturing than Apple did. So, it doesn't make sense that Apple dominated over Atari, and their market share was increasing at the same, even after we were head-to-head with them. And so it clearly says that better technology didn't work. There were other screw-ups going on.
So, obviously you weren't involved with Atari after the computers came out. Is there anything in particular you feel like they could have done differently that would have made it more competitive with the Apples?
Well, I think the technology was good enough, and I just think that it was the way they marketed it and the way they promoted it.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this whole idea of a walled garden, which I don't think has ever worked in the computer business, where it has worked in the game business, walled gardens with licensing and tariffs on cartridges, so you can play the razor blade game. And I can understand that if you're going to take no margin on the hardware, you have to make a little bit of margin on everybody's piece of software.
All right, so let's pick on CEOs. We would like you to state what you think of the following CEOs. Ray Kassar.
Oh, he was a disaster.
Okay. Please elaborate.
He had no feeling for the technology. He didn't understand the technology. He destroyed the corporate culture by becoming very, very elitist. Whereas Atari we didn't even allow, reserved parking places for executives, let alone a limousine and a 3-star chef executive dining room. I mean, those are the trappings that were really antithetical to the Atari corporate culture, a real us versus them kind of thing. And that sort of culminated in the, I'm a high-strung prima donna from, working for Atari kind of.
Right.
Yeah. And that started out. And then the second one is that the company had massive success based on the power of the technology, and the fact that I structured it in such a way that it was very, very hard for there to be competition, and that was, you've heard the story, I'm sure, about tying up all the M channel capacity. That basically I signed contracts with all three, I think there were 3 N-channel capacity boundaries at the time. And I signed a deal for the second, the next VCS with all of them, which basically, with the non-compete, didn't allow them to build a chip, a custom chip like the Stella, for anybody else. And so Ray canceled those contracts, so the ones that we didn't do, and he thought they were, here's Bushnell doing still things again, because he wasn't a strategic game player. And the minute he canceled those, they'd already developed chips. And so one of them went to TI, one of them went to Bally, one of them went to Mattel, and all of a sudden they had, in the space of a single year, they had competition from 3 places where, they couldn't have done that if Atari hadn't already spec'd out the next generation and canceled it.
Well, I was about to ask about the next guy. Let's keep going. If you're even paying attention to the company at this point, James Morgan.
James didn't know what he was doing either. He was trying, but what happened is that you went from a engineering-driven company, a technology-driven company, to a marketing-driven company at exactly the time when all of a sudden their technology was not up to par. And of course, they were hemorrhaging money. They were trying to get rid of overhead as fast as they could, but it always takes a long time, and it's a difficult thing to do. And so, with that being said, he was the wrong guy for the wrong job also. And the company just continued to implode, and that's it ended up going to Jack Tramiel, and Jack was the opposite. He was kind of a guy who thought that you didn't need to market, you just had to drop costs. And that wasn't the right answer either. And so he tried a couple of times at hiring some technology, and he put his sons involved with the Jaguar. And it was kind of problematic. And I think that he really didn't know what to do with the company. It was, he didn't play games. He didn't like games. He was more, basically he started out his life selling sewing machines and then adding machines and what have you. And I think that it was a mismatch in mindset. And he never was really willing to spend what it took to properly launch a product at that point in time. And, when you really look at some of the things, it was good. And, Mike Katz is a really good guy, but he was just never given any real, it's one thing to delegate authority, and it's another thing to not give anybody a budget. And he was severely hampered by the management style of Jack.
Yeah. Did you ever feel like you could? Later, Steve Jobs, was ousted from Apple, then came back. Did you ever wish that you could pull that trick and get back into the seat?
Oh yeah, I tried to, but Warner didn't want to have anything to do with me. They felt that if I was back in and made a success of it, it would make them look stupid.
Wow. Okay.
And to tell you how far that went, I tried to buy the coin-op division, Atari Games, after it had been split up from Atari Corporate, and they wouldn't even give me a chance to bid on it. I had the money raised and everything.
Wow. Okay, so I have a follow-up to that, Nolan. So I don't know if you've been following the current state of the company that calls itself Atari, but we had a listener wondering why you haven't bought the Atari name back to relaunch it properly and modernize the brand.
The answer is very simple. I think that while the brand is important, I think that the amount of money, I actually tried to about 5 years ago, and went through, raised the money, did all kinds of things, and that was when it was it still is a Paris Stock Exchange company, and it was a time when we got the money all raised, and then all of a sudden, the stock almost tripled, and so the cost to buy out the Paris shareholders, and then dealing with the French public company and the procedures, it was scary because there were so many ways that a dissident shareholder could sideline the whole thing that when the stock escalated, it just became not reasonable. And then you get busy with other projects and you say, okay, I've chased that car and bid it and it hurt, and I've chased that car and I bid it and it hurt, and just quit chasing the car.
That's a good analogy. I like that.
Yeah.
I have to ask you, is there any update on the Atari movie?
No, the thing you realize is that there is such a long lead time to get the thing cast and greenlit for actual production. I mean, there are literally thousands of scripts that are laying around that are fully auctioned and ready to go, but for some reason or another don't get greenlit. I actually think if the first Steve Jobs movie had done really, really, really well, I think it would have been greenlit right now. But since it was sort of lackluster, I think that it cast a pall on bioptics of Silicon Valley folk. Now that's amateur analysis, but I kind of think that's what's going on.
So what's one of the most important things that you need to accomplish with the rest of your time on this planet?
Oh, I wanted to create a new amusement park, but call it a micro amusement park. Think of it as a modern arcade, and I think that there was a historical place for the arcade, and the arcade was to bridge the technology that was in the lab when it was too expensive to be in the home. Mm-hmm. And once the home games got on par with the video games, the coin-op business kind of fell off to where it was not nearly as exciting. So if you look at the coin-operated game business now, it's pretty much what we call redemption. Get tickets, get prizes. And that's something that you can't do at home. But they really haven't upped the ante on technology. And there's so many wonderful pieces of technology out there that need to be presented to the public long before they could be brought into the home. And I've actually got a whole plan about a micro amusement park that I think would be massively successful. In fact, I think it would make Chuck E. Cheese look like it's a small time outfit.
Nice. So is this pipe dream or possibility?
In process.
We'll look forward to that.
I think it'll be fun.
So if you could send a message to the Atari 8-bit computer users that still exist, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
Keep up the good work, and my hopes and best wishes are with you. And I think that we had some very, very interesting technology, and I'm really honored that you guys are sticking with it. And remember that there were some interesting innovations, and it's gratifying that the innovations have lasted this long.
Do you keep up with what innovations there are? Because there's still people out there making new hardware and memory upgrades and amazing
software
things.
Yeah.
Software. Yeah.
A little bit, but not definitively.
Yeah. Well, honestly, as podcasters for this machine, it's our job to keep up, and it's hard because sometimes some months will be like 5 new things, or so
exactly.
It's hard to be definitive about it, which is incredible.
Yeah. I know what you mean.
That's amazing for a 35-year-old machine, isn't it?
It really is.
Pretty amazing. Yeah. Well, I have to say we're just extremely honored to talk with you. Nolan, is there anything that we haven't asked you that we should have, or anything else that you want to talk about?
I think the one of the fun issues is to kind of figure, just kind of go down memory lane and think about the woulda, shoulda, couldas and various things. It's great fun. So I guess that's it.
That's it. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. You have fun,
Thank you so much. Bye.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a non-profit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate. Thank you.